Hi. Today we are going to talk about Angela Davis. She, as you all know, is a philosopher, an author, and an academic. But most importantly, she's an activist and a very, very important intellectual figure in the Black Power movement. She was persecuted by the United States government and the FBI. Because of this persecution, in part, she became a very well known figure throughout the world. And especially nowadays, we think of her as an activist against incarceration. Davis continued throughout her life with her work as an educator, and she was also for many years a very high profile member of the Communist Party of the United States. Later, she abandoned the party and she became, as I mentioned earlier, an icon in the abolition of prison movement. In her early days, as a young woman, she went to Germany and studied philosophy at the University of Humboldt. And she studied philosophy with Herbert Marcuse, who was one of the main Marxist philosophers at the time. In 1969, she was hired as an assistant professor in the philosophy department of UCLA. But she has a little bit of a gap in her academic years of teaching, and because she's fired at this time. So she only returns to the US Academy in 1991 until 2008. And this time she comes back as a professor and chair of the Feminist Studies Department of UC Santa Cruz. So, as I said, there was a little bit of a gap in her employment in the academy. As you know, gaps like this drive HR people crazy. They always want to know, why was it that you were not employed at that time? Well, Davis has a really great story about why she wasn't employed at the time. As I mentioned, she was an assistant professor at the time, but Reagan really got on her case in 1969. She had her fired allegedly because she used inflammatory language against police officers. But in reality, the reason why she was being expelled from the university was because she was a prominent member of the Communist Party, and she was also a big time supporter of the Black Panthers. So the memo that we have about why she was fired reads that she used, as I said, inflammatory language, and the report stated that they deemed particularly offensive such utterances as her repeated characterization of the police as pigs. So she was expelled from the university, and things got even worse for her. In 1970, she was accused and arrested for what was considered aggravated kidnapping and first-degree murder of a California judge. Davis always denied her involvement in this, and she said it was persecution, but she was very concerned that as a Black woman, she would be further brutalized in the justice system of the United States, so she fled. But she was later recaptured, and the FBI placed her during this time as on the top list of the 10 most wanted fugitives. So, in any case, Davis was acquitted in 1972 and declared free of all charges in 1980. As I mentioned earlier, she was a member of the Communist Party of the United States. Particularly, she was a member of the Che Lumumba Club, which was an all-Black branch of the party. She was nominated in 1980 and 1984 as candidate for Vice President of the United States for the Communist Party. And later in 1997, she co-founded the Critical Resistance Project, an organization that worked to abolish the prison industrial complex. So she's really an icon of resistance, Black resistance, particularly in the United States. And during this time, she has written and conducted a lot of research about the continuity between mass contemporary incarceration and slavery. She emphasizes how violence underlies the life of Black people on their day-to-day dealings. It's very important for Angela Davis that people understand that if there's been any kind of violence in this country concerning race, that violence was always exerted against Black people. In this text, we are interested on her take on reproduction. Davis is a very strong critic of the abortion movement in the United States. She considered that this movement was too white in its reach, in the sense that they did not think, the white women who were organizing for abortion did not think that for Black women the situation was different, because Black women, what they have experienced is systematic widespread sterilization. Davis also calls about the issue that it's not only Afro-descents that go through this, but also indigenous people and Latinx. She talks about racist public policies that stigmatize, deride, and declare these groups as undesirable and unfit for reproduction. So what Davis accuses the white feminists that rallied for abortion was the fact that they did not consider that while white women were forced to give birth by these laws that took away their capacity to control their reproduction, but at the same time, Black women are being forcefully sterilized because they are considered unwanted. Their children are considered unwanted. And many times, women who are on welfare have this pressure from their doctors that will tell them that unless they become sterilized, they will not be taken care of by this doctor in the future. So if you're living in a rural area and you're poor, this could be a death sentence for you. So many women had to accept sterilization processes just to avoid being completely eradicated or expelled from the healthcare system. So Davis believes that this mass sterilization is not an accident, that it's systematic, and that it points to the widespread use of racist eugenic practices directed at Black and brown bodies. So she declares the denial of reproductive rights as a genocidal violence because it's clearly directed, aimed at people of color to stop them from becoming more numerous. So if we think about the laws in Texas, these new laws in Texas that were passed recently, we can think that there might be a connection here in the sense that these laws might be thought actually to ensure that white people continue to reproduce, because there has been a tendency, especially for middle class people, to not reproduce, for white middle class people to not reproduce. So some people understand that these laws, people like Loretta Ross, for example, another Black activist for reproductive rights, understand that these laws are actually laws that are trying to keep the ethnic imperialism of whites untouched in this country. So we also have to think about the women in ICE detention centers, the Latinx women in ICE detention centers that were also sterilized without their consent. So this is a very, very important text for us to contrast with white feminist takes on abortion and other issues that help us control our reproduction. Nothing really can be understood if we don't look at the race piece here, because while, as I said before, while white women were always encouraged and sometimes even forced to reproduce, the situation was very different for Black women. And this is something that Angela Davis brings up at the same time that she continues to talk about incarceration in the United States.